The house lights dim, and the theater settles into a hush thick enough to hear the rustle of silk and the creak of wooden seats. An orchestra in the pit lifts bows and horns, the conductor raises his baton, and a title card blooms on the screen like a silent trumpet. For a few heartbeats, the audience forgets to breathe. They have never seen a motion picture like this. 3 hours long, a symphony of images, staged with armies of extras and a scale that suggests the entire cast has been coaxed to life inside this room. A cavalry charge gathers on a distant ridge. A camera watches, not as a fixed witness, but as a mind, cutting, gliding, darting to eyes, hands, flags, faces, slicing what was once a blur into meaningful pieces and then rejoining them into a sensation more immediate than memory. The crowd gasps and then applauds what looks like history itself roaring down from the screen. Only later will some step back into the cold air and see the other truth, pamphlets in outraged hands, protests ringing the sidewalk, a film that has fused technical genius to a poisonous myth. The year is 1915. The film is the birth of a nation, and the name that will be both celebrated and condemned for decades to come is David Wark Griffith. He grew up far from any city, in Kentucky fields where stories were currency and memory a kind of religion. Born in 1875 to a family with little money and much pride, he was the son of a veteran of the Confederate Army, a father who wore his defeats like medals and told them again and again until the boy could feel the heat of lost battles he had never seen. The father's nostalgia would scorch the son's imagination and leave marks he would never quite recognize. When the elder Griffith died, the family moved and scrambled, and the dreamy boy who wanted to be a poet worked as a shop clerk, a newsboy, whatever kept the stove warm. He read voraciously, Dickens and the Bible, Shakespeare and dime novels, learning the rhythms of scenes, the tug of cliffhangers, the way one chapter reaches for the next like a hand in the dark. The stage called to him. He found his way to traveling companies and second-rate stock theaters, playing the earnest young man, the villain, whoever needed playing that week. The road taught him how to rehearse quickly, how to steal a laugh with a pause, how to catch a tear with a quiet turn of the head. He watched audiences as much as they watched him. What moved them? Where did their attention go? The theater taught him to think in beats and crescendos, in entrances and exits, in the grammar of patience and surprise. But the stage could not feed his hunger for stories at the size he felt them. He dreamed of writing a great American novel and could not sell the pages. He looked up one day in New York and saw a new industry opening its doors. Moving pictures needed bodies to fill frames and minds to fill reels. His first day on a film set was nothing grand, just a job as an actor for a company that cranked out short films by the dozen. He watched the camera like a magician watching a rival's hands. The director barked, the operator cranked, the actors gestured broadly as if trying to reach the gallery. It felt like theater with the sound turned off and the roof torn away. Yet he sensed something in the cuts, in the way the machine swallowed moments and stitched them together later. The camera did not need to shout. It could whisper. It could look where an audience's eyes wanted to look, if only someone would teach it how. By 1908, he had become a director for the Biograph Company, churning out one-reel dramas at a relentless pace. Melodramas about mothers and money, about betrayals at the mill, about lovers separated by trains and found by fate. He worked with the same actors again and again, the way a theater builds a company, and he found a partner in his cinematographer, Billy Bitzer, who was as eager to experiment with lenses and light as Griffith was with beats and cuts. Together they tried close-ups that focused on a trembling hand rather than a whole room, and the shock made sense. The audience leapt where the camera leapt. They practiced cross-cutting, interlacing two scenes happening at once until the brain knitted them together as one event, and the heart raced toward a resolution that the eye could not yet see. They shaped the idea that a look from one character off-screen could pull the next shot into being. They learned the geography of a space and the way a camera could break it without breaking the audience's map. None of these gestures belonged to one man or one studio. Pioneers in Britain, France, and America had tried pieces of this grammar. but Griffith and Bitzer refined it with a ferocity that made the results feel inevitable. The films were small and sentimental, but within them, the medium discovered its breadth. He directed hundreds of shorts in a handful of years. If a script fell apart at lunchtime, he rewrote it before the afternoon call. If an actor performed like a statue, he whispered a story in her ear, and the statue moved. He coached faces toward subtlety at a time when the stage trained bodies to bellow. He told his company that the camera could read a thought if they truly thought it. Audiences were not as stupid as producers assumed. The Lonedale Operator used cross-cutting to build a rescue with a ferocity that audiences did not know they wanted until the film delivered it. Corner in Wheat braided scenes from the poor, the rich, and the farm in a moral geometry that felt both sermon and reportage. The Musketeers of Pig Alley suggested a world of crime and tenderness in alleys and tenements that looked like they could be walked into from the street outside the theater. For 6 years, he shaped serial storytelling on a diet of single reels and uncredited flyers. He learned to work fast and to trust an intuition that told him where the audience's attention would go before they knew it themselves. By 1914, the world started speaking in features. Italian epics stormed across screens with armies and elephants. The longer form changed what a story could attempt. The company that had paid Griffith to think in short bursts balked at features. He pushed anyway, making Judith of Bethulia a for-real biblical spectacle that suggested the horizons he had in mind. When the studio balked again, he left. He gathered his players, Lillian Gish with a face one could light with a candle, Mae Marsh with a tremor that broke hearts, Henry Walthall and Robert Harron with their quiet gravity, and he teamed with financiers who understood the gamble he wished to take. He began to plan a film about the Civil War, something that would swallow his childhood's myths and spit them back out as pageant and tragedy, and though he did not name it that, propaganda. The Birth of a Nation was built like a siege. He staged battles with veterans advising where regiments might wheel and where they would break. He drilled extras until they moved like soldiers. He pored over photographs from Matthew Brady and paintings that romanticized blue and gray. He built entire towns and then torched them in controlled infernos that left ash and awe. He hired an orchestra and insisted on a score to lift, mourn, and glorify. He demanded tickets be sold like theater seats, with reserved sections and higher prices, turning a movie into a social event. He believed, perhaps more than anyone before him, that a film could be the cultural center of gravity for a season, could summon governors and bankers and preachers to sit in the same dark and leave changed. He was right about the scale and the technique. He was disastrously wrong about the story's soul. The film's craft is hard to deny even now. The cross-cutting that arrives like thunder in the finale. The thrill of a camera that leaps into the saddle and makes a charge feel like a dream. The tender, trembling close-ups that persuade an audience it has looked into a person rather than at a performer. Yet the story it marshals those tools to tell is a lie shot through with venom. It imagines Reconstruction as a nightmare of black rule and white victimhood. Depicts black people, some played by white actors in grotesque makeup, as caricatures of lust and incompetence, and exalts a terror organization as the savior of the nation. Outside the theaters, the NAACP organized protests. In some cities, there were riots. In others, censors demanded cuts. In many towns, the film played as an unchallenged civic lesson, stoking hatred and giving the Ku Klux Klan a recruitment poster with a live orchestra. Inside the industry, a movie became a blueprint for big releases. Outside, it became a wedge that split communities and sent ripples through decades. Its box office helped invent the blockbuster. Its bigotry helped normalize a malignant mythology. The paradox would follow Griffith for the rest of his life. A man who taught movies to speak had put words of poison in their mouth. Stung by the criticism and buoyed by the success, he set out to make a kind of answer, not an apology, but a defense of his belief that moral crusaders and censors were the true danger to art and society. The result was Intolerance, an audacious machine of a movie that cuts among 4 stories set in different centuries. Babylon falling to Cyrus, the massacre of French Huguenots on St. Bartholomew's Day, the Passion of Christ, and a modern tale of reformers whose zeal wrecks the poor. The image that binds them is a mother rocking a cradle through eternity, an emblem of the human heart enduring as empires rise and mobs rage. If The Birth of a Nation bound its technique to a single historical fantasy, Intolerance tries to yoke technique to philosophy. It sets tower, Babylon with walls so vast that extras become dots, and its camera moves with a new confidence, swooping like a bird over stairways. Wandering through crowds as if curiosity had taken human form, the film intercuts with a daring that dares the audience to keep up, building to rescue sequences in which the modern story crashes toward a gallows while ancient cavalry gallop and Christ stumbles toward Calvary. Some viewers marveled, others were bewildered. The film's finances buckled under the weight of its ambition. Intolerance is now taught as a bold high watermark, a protest poem against meddlesome morality written by a man whose own moral vision had failed so profoundly a year before. When the dust settled, Griffith did what he always did. He went back to work. He made Hearts of the World during the war, stitching battlefield footage into a melodrama meant to support the Allied cause. A strange mix of realism and recruitment poster, he made Broken Blossoms, a claustrophobic tragedy about a gentle immigrant and a brutal father, shot with a gauzy tenderness that seems to lift Lillian Gish's face like a flame in a paper lantern. He made Way Down East, a rural melodrama that culminates in one of cinema's purest distillations of suspense. A young woman unconscious on an ice floe, a river boiling with current, a man racing over breaking plates of ice to reach her. The sequence is a masterclass in geography and cross-cutting. It is also a feat of painful realism, as the actors bruise themselves on real ice in real winter to sell the illusion. He made Orphans of the Storm, a French Revolution epic that feels like a cousin to his Civil War fantasies, this time with sisters separated and reunited under the shadow of guillotines. He experimented with early synchronized sound for Dream Street and then embraced it properly for Abraham Lincoln in 1930, an earnest portrait of the president as a humble giant. He shot The Struggle, a small, tough story about alcoholism, and watched as it sputtered at the box office and seemed to confirm what he had long feared. The world he had helped invent was moving on without him. Through these years, he worked like a man who could not bear to sit still when there was a story to tell. On a set, he was a conductor, a traffic cop, a tutor, a drill sergeant, and sometimes a father. He stood next to the camera with a hand cupped to his mouth, calling out, "Now think it," to coax the interior life out of a face. He paced beside the orchestra pit during premieres, conducting the energy of an audience with his own urgency. He nursed grudges against critics and yet read them all. He lost fortunes and found backers. He took refuge in the company of the players who had believed in him when both the theater and the stock market turned cold. The actresses who owed him their first break remembered a taskmaster who also knew where to put the camera to make a soul look luminous. The crew members recalled a director who expected a miracle on a Tuesday and somehow found it by Wednesday. He was not the only teacher in the School of Film Grammar, and many would later argue, rightly, that the grammar was not authored by a single dean. Edwin S. Porter had discovered a crude form of cross-cutting in rescue films a decade earlier. British filmmakers had toyed with close-ups, and the Italians had taught cameras to roll forward like curious carts. The French had stretched time, and the Danes had stripped melodrama to its bone. American producers like Thomas Ince had refined the factory floor of production and invented the idea of a shooting script. Griffith knew some of this and did not know some, and in either case he pushed so hard and assembled so many tendencies into one practice that popular audiences associated the language with him. The credit is too large, the dismissal is too small. He was not a solitary inventor, but a relentless synthesizer, a shaper who understood, almost superstitiously, how invisible a cut could be if it were placed where attention naturally bent. He taught the dissolve to melt like dusk, and the close-up to bite when needed, and to caress when welcomed. He and Bitzer learned how light wanted to wrap a face, and how darkness could hold a secret. He made mistakes in abundance, but he learned in public, and the public learned with him. The harm he did was public too. The Birth of a Nation did not merely offend. It armored a lie with prestige, and sent that lie into the bloodstream of America, at a moment when lynchings were common, and politicians built careers on grievance. Black audiences and leaders knew exactly what the film was and said so. Courts and censors used the controversy around the film to draw lines that would constrain movies for decades. When the Supreme Court ruled in 1915 that motion pictures were business, not art, and thus unprotected by the First Amendment, it did so in a climate charged by the new power of the medium to sway crowds. While that decision was not about Griffith's picture, the spasm of regulation that followed reached into the lives of every filmmaker. And all the while, the film itself toured like a grand old lecture, teaching a lesson that injured its targets and flattered its intended students. Black filmmakers responded by building their own truths on screen. Oscar Micheaux wrote and directed films that argued back, that showed interior lives and dignities the mainstream industry would not honor. Activists organized boycotts and wrote editorials. Communities fought to keep the film out and sometimes lost. To talk about Griffith's genius without talking about this harm is to lie by omission. To talk only about the harm and pretend the technique never mattered is to misunderstand how and why the harm traveled so far. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, sound rearranged cinema's furniture. Actors who could sing and quip were suddenly more useful than those who could weep in silence. Directors who loved the orchestra of montage had to share space with dialogue that insisted on sitting still for a while. Griffith tried to adapt. Abraham Lincoln speaks with the reverence of a schoolbook. The struggle speaks in the hard bark of working-class rooms. They did not connect with audiences who had come to crave a looser comedy or a jazzier rhythm. Studios consolidated power. The independent grandeur with which he once rented halls and toured roadshows no longer fit the economics of a system built on weekly programs and contracts. He retreated, made plans that fizzled, shook hands that did not deliver, and grew older in a town that prefers enthusiasm to memory. People who had been boys and girls when his films first taught them how to look grew up to honor him, and people who suffered from the myths he broadcast grew up to demand that honor be complicated and in some cases withdrawn. Institutions named prizes after him and later removed his name. Film schools taught his sequences frame by frame and then revised syllabi to include the protests that greeted those frames. In interviews, late in life, he defended his intentions and sometimes sounded like a man who wished the world would judge him by the tenderness of a close-up, rather than by the cruelty of a story he had chosen to tell. He died in 1948, not poor, but not triumphant, in a small hotel room, a pioneer whose trail had grown over with traffic that could no longer see the first footprints. What remains is a paradox that resists neat resolution. On one hand, you can sit with a student in an editing room, load way down east, and watch the ice sequence build from wide to tight, from river to face, from peril to rescue, and you can feel the pulse of a technique that still works today. You can trace a line from those intercutting rhythms to the chase sequences of blockbusters a century later. You can point to how a close-up carries a novel's interiority onto a face, how a lens can make a sigh visible. On the other hand, you can step outside the classroom, read the flyers from 1915, talk with communities whose grandparents saw themselves slandered and targeted by a movie's story, and you can feel the pulse of anger that still makes sense today. Both truths sit in the same room. The moving image owes some of its grammar to a man whose most famous sentence was a damning lie. Perhaps the most honest way to tell his story is to keep two screens running in your head at once. On one, a director stands just behind a camera, whispering to an actress to let her thought drift to the door, and then, only then, to let her eyes follow, because he knows he will cut on that thought and the audience will feel it. On the other, outside the theater, men in white robes march by torchlight and call themselves reborn. On one screen, a camera slides down a Babylonian staircase at a height that makes your stomach dip. On the other, a city council debates whether to let a film run because its lies might ignite a riot. On one, a young filmmaker studies how to lead an audience's attention like a melody. On the other, a teacher explains how myth masquerading as truth can do real harm. The two screens are not balanced like an algebra. They do not cancel each other out. They demand that we hold them together as we talk about the beginnings of an art that is also a technology, that is also a business, that is also a machine for empathy, that can, in the wrong hands or even simply in the wrong story, become a machine for erasure. D.W. Griffith did not invent cinema, but he helped it become a language, and he used that language to speak things both beautiful and terrible. The task for anyone who loves movies is to study the craft he advanced without swallowing a single one of the lies he broadcast. It means teaching students to decode cross-cutting while decoding the cultural politics woven into the cut. It means acknowledging the collaborators who shaped those techniques, the cinematographers and editors and actors who brought nuance where melodrama might have smothered it. And it means naming the contemporaries and predecessors who deserve a share of the credit for the grammar we inherited. It means refusing to tidy up the past in order to make it easier to admire. The truth is not tidy, neither is cinema. Think again of the orchestra in that darkened theater as the cavalry gathers on the ridge. The conductor lifts his baton. The audience leans forward. For a moment, everyone believes they are safe inside a story, that the light can only entertain and cannot wound. The charge begins, the cuts tighten, the rhythm accelerates. Some cheer, and others feel a coldness even as the image burns bright. The life and legacy of D.W. Griffith live in that split second. The thrill of an art discovering its power and the dread of what that power can do. To love movies is to learn from that moment, without becoming its captive. To acknowledge both the brilliance of the technique and the responsibility of the storyteller. We can thank the craft and reject the myth. We can slow the cut and look at what it was designed to make us miss. We can keep both screens in view as we walk out into the light, ready to make new images that remember what was possible and refuse what should never be repeated.